It was the summer of 1941. The German army, unstoppable until now, thundered across the vast fields of the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa had begun, the largest invasion in history. Thousands of tanks rolled eastward, engines roaring, confident that victory was inevitable. To the German commanders, this was to be another lightning-fast campaign, just like France, Norway, and Poland. But in the distance, beyond the horizon, a secret was waiting. A machine unlike anything they had ever faced. At first, reports trickled in. Strange Russian tanks appearing on the battlefield, sloped armor, thick plates that deflected shells that should have torn through them. German anti-tank guns, once so reliable, suddenly failed to penetrate. Crews watched in disbelief as their rounds bounced harmlessly off the angled hulls of these mysterious vehicles. The name whispered through radio chatter sent a chill down command lines. T-34. No one in the Wehrmacht had seen anything like it. When the first T-34s rolled into combat, they didn't just shock the German infantry. They terrified the armored divisions. The Panzer III and IV, the pride of Germany's tank force, were suddenly outmatched. The T-34 could move faster across rough terrain, shrug off hits, and return fire with deadly precision. For the first time, the German blitzkrieg met something it couldn't easily crush. But what truly fascinated the German officers wasn't just how strong the T-34 was, it was how simple. After the chaos of early encounters, a few T-34s were captured intact, abandoned by their crews or disabled without catastrophic damage. One of these was hauled to a testing ground deep behind the front lines. The Germans surrounded it like archaeologists uncovering an alien artifact. Generals, engineers, and mechanics all gathered around, eager to discover what made this Soviet machine so formidable. They expected to find some kind of technological marvel, a masterpiece of Soviet engineering. But when they lifted the engine hatches, opened the crew compartment, and began to examine the systems, what they found stunned them for a different reason entirely. Inside, the T-34 wasn't elegant. It wasn't even neat. It was brutally simple. And that, the Germans realized, was its genius. The welds were rough, the fittings crude, the finish uneven. But every part served a purpose. No excess luxury, no unnecessary complexity. Every component was designed to be easily replaced, easily maintained, even in the mud and chaos of the Eastern Front. To the Germans, who prized precision engineering and complex machinery, this simplicity was both shocking and brilliant. The T-34 had been designed not by dreamers in clean factories, but by realists who understood what war demanded: reliability, speed, and the ability to repair a tank in the field using whatever was available. The Germans couldn't believe it. Back in their workshops, the Panzer divisions relied on meticulously crafted machines, tanks that required skilled labor, careful maintenance, and specialized parts. Every gear, every valve, every tool had to fit perfectly. But that perfection came with a price. When something broke, and in war, something always broke, repairs could take days, even weeks. The T-34, by contrast, could be patched up in hours. A damaged track, a cracked gear, a punctured radiator. Soviet crews could fix these with little more than hammers, wrenches, and sheer determination. This discovery would haunt German engineers for years to come. But before we get there, it's worth asking, how did the Soviets create such a tank in the first place? The answer lies in the 1930s. In a Soviet Union that was rapidly industrializing under the shadow of Stalin's rule. Factories rose from nothing, railroads expanded into the wilderness, and the Red Army began to modernize. The Soviet leadership understood one thing clearly. The next war would be fought with machines, and those machines needed to be built not for luxury, but for survival. The T-34 was born out of a brutal understanding of the battlefield. It was developed by a team led by Mikhail Koshkin at the Kharkov locomotive factory, under conditions so harsh that Koshkin himself would die before seeing his creation's full success. He envisioned a tank that could operate in mud, snow, and dust, one that didn't need perfect conditions or perfect parts to function. Koshkin's engineers tested prototypes in secret, driving them thousands of kilometers through forests and rivers. They wanted a tank that could survive neglect, abuse, and the chaos of war. The result was revolutionary, a tank that combined speed, armor, and firepower in a balance no other nation had achieved. It featured sloped armor, a design choice that would later become standard in tank development worldwide. Its 76.2mm gun could destroy any German tank of 1941 from long range, and its wide tracks allowed it to glide over the soft Russian soil that bogged down German vehicles. To the Soviets, it was a masterpiece of practicality. To the Germans, it was a nightmare. And yet, when German officers finally got their hands on a captured T-34, their admiration grew. They realized the Soviet engineers had outsmarted them, not with refinement, but with ruggedness. The Germans noted that the T-34's diesel engine was less likely to catch fire than their gasoline-powered Panzers. They observed how its suspension system, the Christie suspension, allowed for greater speed and smoother rides over uneven ground. And they marveled at how few tools were needed to strip down and rebuild major components. It was as if the tank had been designed by a farmer, someone who valued things that worked over things that looked good. One officer reportedly remarked, "This is not a tank built for parades, it's built for war." The German engineers quickly sent detailed reports back to Berlin. They even used captured T-34s in their own forces, marking them with black crosses and deploying them against their creators. But more importantly, they studied it. They disassembled every bolt and screw, trying to learn its secrets. Those secrets would go on to inspire one of Germany's most ambitious projects, a tank that could compete with the T-34 on its own terms. But even as they studied the Soviet design, they misunderstood something fundamental. They thought they could improve upon it, make it more powerful, more advanced, more precise. What they didn't realize was that the T-34's power came not from sophistication, but from simplicity. And that misunderstanding, that obsession with over-engineering, would become one of Germany's most critical mistakes in the tank war to come. As the Eastern Front grew bloodier and the winters colder, the German army began to realize that perfection was not what won wars. Endurance was. The T-34 would keep coming, in greater numbers, repaired, rebuilt, and returned to battle faster than any Panzer could ever hope to match. And so, in that captured workshop, surrounded by officers and engineers, a quiet realization settled in among the Germans. They weren't just fighting a tank, they were fighting an idea. The captured T-34 sat in the testing yard, its green paint chipped and scarred from battle, but its presence commanded silence. Around it, German officers, engineers, and mechanics formed a circle. Some were curious, others skeptical. To them, this was the machine that had humiliated their most trusted panzers. Colonel Heinz Guderian himself, one of Germany's foremost tank strategists, had heard the rumors and demanded to see one up close. When the hatches were opened, a wave of diesel fumes and mud-soaked air spilled out. The officers leaned closer, expecting to find some ingenious mechanism, a secret advantage hidden beneath its steel skin. What they saw instead looked crude. The interior was cramped, barely enough space for the crew to move. The welding lines were rough, the metal edges sharp. Bolts didn't align perfectly, and some wiring looked improvised. To German eyes, trained to value perfection and precision, it looked ugly. But as the engineers began to examine each system, their confusion deepened. Every part had been designed with astonishing practicality. The gearbox could be reached in minutes. The transmission could be removed without dismantling the entire hull. The engine, a simple yet powerful V2 diesel, was accessible through wide hatches, built to be swapped out in the field with minimal equipment. It dawned on them, the Soviets had designed this tank for war, not for comfort. For soldiers, not for engineers. One German mechanic reportedly said, "Our tanks are made to impress generals. This one is made to win battles." They took apart the suspension next. The Christie suspension system, named after an American inventor, whose ideas the Soviets had quietly adopted years earlier. Unlike the stiff, fragile leaf spring systems in many German tanks, this one used large road wheels and coil springs. The result was astonishing mobility. The T-34 could travel over broken terrain at high speeds, while Panzers bogged down or through their tracks. Even the tracks themselves impressed the Germans. They were wide, almost double the width of those on a Panzer III, allowing the T-34 to glide over mud and snow that would trap German vehicles. The simplicity of the track links meant replacements could be hammered in place without precision tools. To German engineers, who relied on delicate machining and tight tolerances, it was heresy. But in war, it was brilliance. They moved to the armor next. This was where the true shock set in. The T-34's armor wasn't the thickest on the battlefield, but its shape was revolutionary. Instead of flat vertical plates, the Soviets had sloped the armor at steep angles. This design meant that incoming shells were more likely to ricochet off, increasing the effective thickness without adding weight. It was so effective that it rendered many of Germany's standard anti-tank weapons useless. German analysts performed tests, firing at the captured tank with 37mm and 50mm rounds. To their disbelief, the shells bounced off harmlessly. They tried again, at closer range. The result was the same. The T-34 shrugged it off like rain. One officer wrote in his report, "It seems invincible from the front." That line sent a wave of panic through the Wehrmacht's upper command. The discovery of the T-34's design triggered a massive reevaluation of German tank development. Engineers were ordered to create a countermeasure, something that could match its armor, its gun, and its mobility. This led to the birth of the Panther tank, a machine inspired directly by the T-34. The Germans even used the captured Soviet vehicle as a model, measuring its armor angles and studying its engine layout. But here's the twist. In their obsession with matching and surpassing it, the Germans repeated their old mistake. The Panther became a marvel of engineering. Complex, expensive, and maintenance-heavy. It was deadly on paper, but prone to breakdowns in the field. Its transmission failed frequently. Its fuel consumption was enormous, and repairs often required full workshops. Meanwhile, the T-34 continued to roll off Soviet production lines by the thousands, repaired in trenches, patched with spare parts, and sent back into combat within hours. As the war dragged on, the simplicity of the T-34 became its greatest weapon. In the field, Soviet crews could fix broken tanks in freezing blizzards, hammering metal plates into place, using spare track links as improvised armor. Factories across the Soviet Union, some operating in makeshift warehouses and even open-air assembly lines, produced thousands more every month. German intelligence reports from 1942 and 1943 reveal their growing frustration. One report noted, "For every tank we destroy, they replace it with 3 more. And those replacements weren't just numbers, they were evolving." The Soviets improved the T-34 throughout the war, upgrading its gun to an 85mm cannon, reinforcing its armor, and refining its components while keeping its simplicity intact. Meanwhile, the Germans struggled with their own creations. The Tiger tank, for all its power, required days of maintenance and vast fuel reserves. It was like a lion that couldn't hunt without a team of servants. The T-34, on the other hand, was a wolf, fast, adaptable, and dangerous in packs. By 1943, entire German units reported facing waves of T-34s advancing across the steppes, moving like an unstoppable tide. Commanders spoke of how the tanks would appear even after being destroyed the day before, repaired overnight by field crews working by lantern light. One German officer, after examining another captured T-34 in 1943, wrote in disbelief, "It is built with peasant logic." He didn't mean it as an insult. It was respect. It meant the design could be understood by ordinary soldiers, not just specialists. That peasant logic was exactly what made it superior. Even the tank's gun, the 76.2mm F-34 cannon, was a masterpiece of efficiency. It lacked the high-precision optics of German guns, but it fired fast, reliably, and packed enough power to punch through a Panzer at range. German crews began to fear the T-34's silhouette. That low, sloping hull and distinct turret became a symbol of Soviet endurance. It haunted their dreams and dominated their battlefields. Perhaps the most astonishing fact came later in the war, when German factories attempted to simplify their own designs to match the Soviet approach. But they couldn't. The entire German industrial philosophy was built around craftsmanship, not mass production. The Soviets, by contrast, had mastered the art of good enough. Each T-34 was not a masterpiece. It was a tool, forged in desperation, meant to be used, damaged, repaired, and used again. That mindset, the Germans realized, was the true advantage. Every time they examined a captured T-34, they found something new to admire, or to fear. The tank's parts could be swapped between models. Its engine could run on low-quality fuel. Even its armor alloy was designed to be made with imperfect materials, allowing Soviet factories to keep producing despite shortages. And so, as the Germans took notes and measurements, a grim truth set in. The T-34 wasn't just a tank. It was a symbol of the Soviet war machine itself. Crude, resilient, and unstoppable. The officers who examined that first captured T-34 would later admit privately that they knew, in that moment, the war would not be won easily. Because if the enemy could build something this simple, this effective, and build so many of them, then the tide of war might already be turning. The autumn of 1942 brought rain and mud to the Eastern Front. Oceans of mud that swallowed entire convoys. German tanks stalled, their treads choking on the thick sludge. Mechanics worked knee-deep in freezing water, struggling to clean clogged engines. Commanders screamed over radios for movement that wouldn't come. But across those same desolate plains, the T-34s kept moving. Their wide tracks and diesel engines allowed them to plow through terrain that would have defeated any other vehicle. They didn't stop for weather or roads or even the setting sun. They moved like ghosts, silent, relentless, everywhere. In the chaos of the Soviet counteroffensives, captured German soldiers would later tell their interrogators about the sound that haunted them most. The distant growl of T-34 engines in the dark, closing in through the mist. By the time of the Battle of Stalingrad, the T-34 was no longer just a tank. It was a legend. Soviet factories were producing them faster than the Germans could destroy them. Crews trained in weeks, not months. The machines were so standardized that any damaged T-34 could be cannibalized to fix another. And when the Germans tried to push back, they found themselves outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and outlasted. For all its might, the German war machine was cracking under the weight of its own complexity. The Panther, the Tiger, monstrous machines of steel and fire, were mechanical marvels, but they demanded care and resources the front could no longer provide. Every kilometer they advanced, they needed supply chains, specialized crews, and spare parts that never arrived. Their engines overheated, their transmissions seized, their tracks broke in cold weather. Meanwhile, Soviet soldiers were using the same T-34 design in deserts, forests, frozen lakes, and city ruins. Crews slept under their tanks, cooked meals on the engine deck, and painted the words Zarodinu, for the motherland, on the turrets before charging into battle. The Germans had studied the T-34 to learn its secrets, but they had misunderstood its soul. They thought the key was design. It wasn't. The key was philosophy. While the Germans built perfection, the Soviets built persistence. While one Tiger might dominate a battlefield, 10 T-34s would simply swarm it, repairing each other, towing each other, dying and returning, again and again. And that was the genius of the machine that those German officers had once stood around in awe of. They had admired its simplicity, but they hadn't realized it was a weapon born of necessity and of a nation's will to survive. As the war turned against Germany, those same officers watched their once mighty tank divisions collapse under the endless tide of Soviet armor. At Kursk, in the summer of 1943, the largest tank battle in history erupted. More than 6,000 tanks clashed in a storm of fire and steel. There, the T-34 faced the Panthers and Tigers that had been designed to destroy it. And yet, despite their superior guns and armor, the German tanks faltered. Mechanical failures crippled many before they even reached the front line. The T-34s, crude and loud, kept moving. It wasn't a duel of equals. It was a test of endurance. And endurance won. German officers later described seeing the battlefield littered with burning wrecks, both Soviet and German. But only one side had the strength to replace them by morning. Factories in the Ural Mountains, far from German bombers, churned out T-34s day and night. Women, teenagers, and old men worked shifts under freezing conditions, assembling tanks that would roll straight from the line to the front. It became a symbol of industrial heroism and grim determination. By 1944, when Soviet forces began pushing westward, the Germans realized their nightmare had come true. The same machine they had once examined so carefully had multiplied into an unstoppable army. In desperate moments, German crews even captured and reused T-34s themselves, repainting them with black crosses and fighting against their creators. Some German tankers admitted later that they preferred the Soviet machine. It was easier to maintain, more reliable, and less prone to failure than their own. Imagine that! The most advanced army in the world, relying on the enemy's tank to survive. But even then, it wasn't enough. By 1945, the Red Army's armored spearheads, composed mostly of T-34s, were rolling through Poland, East Prussia, and into Berlin itself. The machine that had first shocked the Germans in 1941 was now rumbling through the ruins of their capital, its tracks grinding over the broken stones of the Reich. The war had come full circle. The T-34 had not just won battles, it had won a war of production, of endurance, of philosophy. When the smoke finally cleared, historians would look back and realize that the T-34 had changed everything. Its sloped armor became the standard for tank design worldwide. Its simple diesel engine concept influenced generations of vehicles. Its legacy stretched into the Cold War, copied, modified, and exported to dozens of countries. Even today, decades later, in conflicts around the world, the echo of that same design can still be found. A machine built in desperation became one of the most iconic symbols of 20th century warfare. As for those German officers who first examined the captured T-34s in 1941, some survived the war, others didn't. But those who did left behind notes, diaries, and reports filled with reluctant admiration. One of them, reflecting years later, wrote, "We built tanks for engineers. They built tanks for soldiers. That is why they won." That single sentence captures the entire story, not just of a tank, but of an era. The T-34 was never meant to be perfect. It was meant to survive, and to make sure its crew did too. It was the embodiment of a harsh truth, that in war, simplicity and reliability are far deadlier than complexity and pride. So when those German officers looked at that first captured T-34 covered in mud and battle scars, they couldn't believe how simple it was to repair. What they didn't realize, not yet, was that they weren't just looking at a tank. They were looking at the future, because behind that rough welding and crude metal was an idea, powerful enough to outlast empires, that strength doesn't always come from sophistication. Sometimes it comes from the will to endure, to adapt, and to keep fighting, no matter what breaks. And that's why, even today, the T-34 stands not just as a machine of war, but as a monument to the power of simplicity and the lesson that Germany learned too late. The war for perfection was lost. The war for survival was won. And it was won by a tank the world underestimated, until it was far too late.